Okay, we'll turn the time over to Jeff Ames then.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. This will be an overview of facilities. This is not going to be looking at the nuts and bolts, the width of doorways, and the slopes of ramps or anything like that, but more about why and wherefore facility changes need to be made. First of all, I have to just let you know that I have no legal authority. We operate the Rocky Mountain ADA Center under a grant from the National Institute on Disability and Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. It's a nonprofit grant. Meeting the Challenge is a for-profit company, but we've operated this grant project since October of 1991. We will begin our sixth five-year cycle on the grant on October 1st, so we're kind of excited about that. We're one of 10 centers around the country. The national network does a variety of different things, primarily answering the phones and giving technical assistance, and of course delivering training such as this one. And anywhere in the country, if you dial 800-949-4232, you will be connected to your regional ADA center. So, where do we begin? Well, first of all, Title II of the ADA, I always say, is the thou shalt nots. You're prohibited from discriminating against people with disabilities. So basically, the law protects individuals with disabilities in their access to public programs and services. It prohibits public entities from excluding or denying those benefits in public programs because of a person's disability. And because of public entities, facilities are inaccessible, that would be a reason. For example, if you have a swim lessons as a program that you offer and your swimming pool is not accessible, that would be a discriminatory act. And just in general terms, that is what Title II of the ADA is about. It's preventing people from being discriminated against because of their disabilities. So, when we talk about the ADA and existing facilities, the first requirement is that you should provide access to your programs when viewed in their entirety, and that means those programs and services need to be usable, accessible to people with disabilities. For an example, we could talk about something like most counties in this country have some level of involvement in polling activity, and they register voters. If somebody was to offer that you can come and register to vote as long as you climb to the ivory tower of the county clerk, which is on the third floor of a building without an elevator, it would be pretty obvious that for some people with disabilities, accessing that location in order to register to vote would be discriminatory. So what can you do about that? Well, you could put an elevator in that building, but maybe that's not feasible. You could also offer that registration capacity at the public library or DMV or online, or possibly even say to people, if you can't come to us to register to vote, we'll send somebody from the county clerk's office to your house and we'll get your registration at home. In which case then the program viewed in its entirety would be accessible. So the law doesn't specifically require that a public entity make each and every one of its facilities accessible. It requires that every program viewed in its entirety should be accessible. And it doesn't require public entities taking any action that would destroy the historic significance of a building. So quite often we see, I'm here in Colorado, some of the mining towns have got courthouses that were built in the late 19th century, and they're all stairs and narrow doorways and so on and so forth. And at some level, if programs are offered in those buildings, they've got to be made accessible. It doesn't necessarily require tearing those buildings down or rebuilding them, but in some cases it may require moving programs or offering those programs at another location that is accessible. Among the things that public entities are not required to do, not required to take any action that would result in a fundamental alteration. and you're not required to take any action that would result in undue financial and administrative burdens. These are both reasonably high hurdles to get over, but there are cases where both of these could apply, or either of them could apply. If you decided that you couldn't do something because of fundamental alteration or undue financial and administrative burden, you still have the obligation to find some alternative means to make the program accessible, and if you're going to say something is not possible because of financial and administrative burdens, the responsibility for documenting that and making that decision goes to the head of the public entity that makes that choice. So it could be the chairman of Board of County Commissioners, or the mayor, city manager, somebody who has the authority to sign off on something and take the responsibility. And as I said, even in those events, there's still an obligation of a public entity to do as much as it can through some other methods or means to make their services accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. So those other methods and means could include the redesign or acquisition of equipment. For example, providing voting machines that are audio accessible to people who are blind. It could mean moving a program to a different building. So for instance, you've got that courthouse that was built in 1892 and it's not accessible, and you're still holding your court sessions in there, and somebody shows up who's a party to a case, or maybe just a member of the public who wants to observe that, which the public can do, and they're in a wheelchair and you can't get them into the building. You've got to find a different venue then that would be accessible. You can actually do things where you assign somebody to assist people with disabilities in certain situations. Typically, this might actually just be people who normally perform administrative functions. I think of, like, say, a Department of Human Services, where a client may come to the offices and they are in the lobby area, and they say, I need to see my counselor, and they're in a wheelchair, and the counselor that they're going to see lives in this little cubicle of an office somewhere in the back of the facility. So their counselor comes out and meets them at a locked door and says, why don't we go down to this conference room at the end of the hall? There's plenty of room there. So those kind of situations. As I mentioned, possibly the county clerk is going to send somebody out to do a home visit and collect the information they need for registration there. Anytime you can deliver services at alternate accessible sites, in other words, find places that you can go and provide the service, the program, and deliver the same advantages and benefits to an individual by offering it at a different location. Or you can get to this point where you actually have to do some structural changes to do the architectural things. You notice this isn't at the top of the list, but that's what we're talking about today. I just want to make it clear that it isn't always a situation where you have to, get out the jackhammer and, remove concrete and replace stairs with a ramp. In some services, you're using, some sort of transportation. You may have to alter that transportation or find an alternate means of providing transportation for people who have disabilities. So any of these methods, means that provide the program access without taking apart physical structures and rebuilding them are also acceptable. The concept of safe harbor in facilities refers to construction of facilities after the ADA came into effect, and we had the original ADAG, the ADA Accessibility Guidelines, which were recognized as standards for accessibility, also the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. If something was constructed in conformance with those prior to March 15th of 2012, there's no requirement to once again bring them up to the 2010 standards. So if you made it right once, the law doesn't require you to go back and do that again. However, there are some things that don't get safe harbor because, as an example, most of the recreation facilities and elements of those facilities did not exist in the ADAG, and they do exist in the 2010 standards. So for those supplemental items, there is no position of safe harbor. Now, forward-thinking entities probably went out and looked at some of those standards before they became standards, when they were guidelines, which was for about 6 years before they were actually adopted by the Department of Justice, and realized that they needed to do certain things to make recreation facilities such as playgrounds, fishing piers, let me go back a second there, skipped one too far, even firing positions at shooting facilities have standards now for accessibility. And of course, swimming pools and miniature golf, a bunch of other areas that are covered now by the standards. As far as historical preservation goes, I use this slide with the Statue of Liberty because that's a national park. A lot of people don't realize that, but the Statue of Liberty is a national park or a national monument. And essentially, there is no way in Lady Liberty to change the spiral staircase that goes up through her torso to her head into an elevator or an accessible route. So what's been done there is a lot of other methods to provide the experience of the Statue of Liberty are provided in the lobby area, including a replica of the face of the statue, videos of the different views that can be seen from the top of the statue. So what you need to do when you're dealing with these historical facilities is give priority to providing physical access to people, but when you can't do that, you can also use some of these alternative methods. And technology is a big helper here. Another example of the kind of building that I think of from my youth, our 8th grade class trip, we traveled to, I grew up in the Chicago area, we traveled south to New Salem, Illinois, which was the home of Abraham Lincoln. And there's some log cabins there, and certainly building ramps to those cabins and widening the doors to make them accessible to somebody in a wheelchair would not be appropriate. It would destroy the historicity of those facilities. So other means of providing a 360-degree video tour of the inside of the facility, and providing, for example, where you have placards that display information about the facility, also providing some sort of an audio format to deliver that same information in a format that's accessible to people who are blind or visually impaired. If there's a docent or a guide going through the facility talking about the facility, it'd be a good idea to have that information available in a text format for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. So there's a lot of things you can do to make a historical facility accessible without destroying the features and qualities of the facility that make it historical. So using audiovisual materials is one solution. Assigning persons to guide who can give information in a variety of formats. Any kind of innovative methods that you can find to help people enjoy the experience, even if they do have a disability. Now we're going to talk a little bit here about kind of the a transition plan was something that was intended to be done and completed in the mid-90s at the latest. I can tell you that MTC provides consulting services to help people develop transition plans on a daily basis, because a lot of that work was not done back in the 90s, or it was never completed. And one of the first things that the Department of Justice will require of public entities in the event of an investigation is, can we see your transition plan? Can we see what things you plan to fix and what you fixed, and so on and so forth. So a transition plan is required whenever, in order to provide access to programs there are architectural changes that must be made. So, for example, courthouse, maybe there is a way to make it accessible, and you decide you're going to, build an elevator on the back side, or somehow you're going to provide a way to get vertically from floor to floor in the building, and then you realize, of course, that there has to be a route from the parking lot to that point where you can use the elevator, and you realize that you have to provide accessible parking spaces there. So your transition plan would list each of those deficiencies and prescribe a method for fixing them, and then kind of schedule when those things are supposed to happen. And this is required of any public entity that employs 50 or more people, and that was required to be developed within 6 months of January 26, 1992. So the clock has been ticking for a long time on that. So the transition plan sets forth all of those things that need to be done in order to make facilities accessible. Now, in some cases, your transition plan might identify that there's no vertical access within a building, and that there's a bunch of programs that the public needs to access in that building, and that there's no technically feasible way to provide an elevator in that building. At which point, a public entity has to decide how it is going to make that program accessible without making those alterations. So in other words, the response to that physical barrier might not necessarily be an architectural change. It might be a change of venue. It might be just a different way of delivering the program that would eliminate the barrier. And so what is an alteration? That is a change to a building or a facility. This is not clearly defined exactly in the standards and regulations. It's sort of, by intuition you figure it out. But anytime you're doing any kind of remodeling, renovating, rehabilitating, reconstructing, any of these structural changes that are going to change configurations of walls, and so on and so forth, any full height partitions, any of those changes that affect or might affect the usability of a facility, those are alterations. And if those alterations are done to a primary use area, so for example, in a city hall, primary use area might be the room where city council meets, which could be an actual assembly area with designed seating and a PA system and so on and so forth. And you're going to do changes to that. The public is allowed to come there to participate in those public meetings. So if you're going to do changes to that space, that's definitely a primary use area. And that change then will trigger a requirement for improvements to the accessibility of the path of travel. So how you get to that space, from the accessible parking outside to the entrance to the building, down the hallway, into that room, all of those things are part of the path of travel. And if you're changing that primary use area, then you're going to have to look at what things you might need to do to improve that path of travel. In the ADA, all renovations are alterations, but all alterations are not necessarily renovations. I mean, you could be making changes that are minor changes that are going to affect accessibility that don't really even look like a renovation to a building. For example, restriping a parking lot isn't really a renovation, but restriping a parking lot is an alteration that could affect accessibility. So when you restripe a parking lot, by definition, that is an alteration. Similarly, when you resurface a street, that's an alteration. But not all alterations are going to trigger these path of travel improvements. So, doing something as an alteration, you do need to take into account what your path of travel is, and, realize that there might be some implications. There are things that you can alter in a facility, such as the HVAC system, or the electrical system, possibly some plumbing changes that might have no immediate effect or even potential effect on accessibility. On the other hand, they might, if you're changing the HVAC system in a building, it's going to change air pressure, interior to exterior, and between different spaces in a building, which might affect the force required to open a door. And if it's harder to open a door, you have affected the accessibility of a building in the process. So then comes up the question of disproportionality. This is a concept I get questions on all the time, trying to define, do we have to do something to disproportionality? What do we count to assess disproportionality? If alterations to improve your path of travel are going to cost more than 20% of the cost of the alteration, the part of the alteration that affects or might affect accessibility to a primary use area, you don't have to do those things. So if you were doing some, minor structural changes, maybe, for example, changing the floor surface of an area that was a primary use area, and it was going to cost you, say $5,000 to do that, you would have a disproportionality requirement of $1,000. Now, if the floor of the building where you were doing that change, that alteration, was not accessible by elevator, and it was going to cost you, $100,000 to put an elevator in the building, that far exceeds the 20% disproportionality, so you would not be required to do that. But the cost that can be included, anything that has to do with improving an accessible entrance, an accessible route to the altered area, such as widening doorways or installing ramps. This can include exterior areas, so if you do something to improve the accessible parking, the path of travel from that accessible parking to the building, path of travel from public right-of-way, from a public sidewalk, or from a public transit stop, any of those route improvements could be included in that amount toward disproportionality. Eventually, you might get into the building, and along the path of travel to this primary use area, you might find, you've got some restrooms. Well, those restrooms should be brought into compliance as much as, technically feasible within the limits of disproportionality. Simple things like installing grab bars, insulating pipes, those kinds of things, putting in accessible, faucet controls, things such as that, are typically going to fall within that realm of disproportionality. Further down the way, if you have public phones, you need to provide those with volume controls, possibly provide TTYs at those places. This is, a structural thing that's required in the standards. Nowadays, there's a lot of technological ways to work around the TTY requirements. Any costs you might have to relocate, redesign, replace a drinking fountain. Again, this is pretty far down the list of things that are required, but if you don't have anything else to fix, and this is within that disproportionality, it should be done. A point I make here is that if you had an older drinking fountain that was put in prior to March 15th of 2012, and it complies with the ADAG, or the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards, having a spout height that's appropriate and knee clearance underneath, and accessible controls, et cetera, and now you're doing alterations. If you were going to change that, you wouldn't necessarily have to change that drinking fountain under safe harbor provisions because it would be compliant. But if you were going to move the drinking fountain anyway or do alterations directly to that, then you would have to bring it up to the 2010 standards, which requires a high-low fountain. So not only the fountain that's wheelchair accessible, but a fountain that's accessible for people who are taller and need to bend over and can't bend over because of a disability to reach the lower fountain. And what about sidewalks? Every Project Civic Access Settlement Agreement that we have seen addresses sidewalks. The regulation simply states that, you know, if a public entity, a county or a city or whatever, has any authority over roadways or streets, then they have a responsibility to provide accessible pedestrian infrastructure where accessible pedestrian infrastructure exists adjacent to those streets. So if you're doing an alteration to a street, you need to look at those features as well. But initially, your transition plan should include documentation of all those areas where you have sidewalks that cross curb lines that are not provided with a curb ramp or other sloped area to provide vertical access. And then that schedule should be created to, you know, basically deliver accessibility over a period of time. There should be prioritization in this, and this is pretty complex, but think of it in terms of where you're going to have the most pedestrian traffic, and, you know, that's going to be also the areas that are probably serving what the regulations called entities covered by the Act. So in other words, if you've got a local government building, someplace people pay their water bill, or a public library, or, you know, a post office, any kind of those facilities, you would want to make sure that you have accessible pedestrian infrastructure around those. Any place, other covered entities include places of public accommodation, private retail businesses, and of course employment, places of employment. Employers are covered by Title I of the ADA. That can be public and private employers. So any place that you know, employs people, you should be addressing your pedestrian infrastructure. And then of course any other areas, you know, if you've got, you know, public transportation, you know, makes little sense to make an accessible bus stop in the middle of the block that's not connected to sidewalks and curb ramps at corners adjacent to that bus stop. And finally, you know, you can deal with your pedestrian facilities in, you know, residential parts of the community. Residential areas are not covered by the ADA, but you have to remember that your walkways serve your entire community. So any place you have built sidewalks, there should be a plan to make sure that they're accessible. And I call this the first and last block idea because, in the words of the Federal Highway Administration, because the sidewalk is the basic unit of mobility within our overall system of transportation, every route and facility must be usable. So that means at some point in time, if you've got areas of neighborhoods that are, you know, 28-inch wide sidewalks, they're going to have to be improved. I should make it clear at this point there are no enforceable standards for the public right-of-way at this point in time. To some extent you can use the 2010 ADA standards, but the United States Access Board has developed guidelines for accessible pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, affectionately referred to as the PROAG, and these are arguably equivalent facilitation that can be used in place of the 2010 ADA standards. These specify design approaches that are more practical for the public right-of-way, where you don't have the limitations of a site. You have roads that are at existing grades, and, you know, you can't necessarily make an accessible sidewalk with nothing more than a 5% grade next to a road when the road's got a 7 or 8% grade. So there's some issues that are addressed there. There are different designs for curb ramps than the basic design that shows up in the ADA standards. There's a provision for pedestrian access routes to be a minimum of 48 inches wide, which is wider than an accessible route within a building. All of those things are much more practical and are much more applicable in the public right-of-way. So I certainly recommend an awareness of the PROAG for communities that have pedestrian infrastructure that they need to make accessible. So what exactly is a transition plan? What are the elements of it? There are 4 basic elements. First of all, you need to create a list, identify all those barriers that might prevent access to programs. Now, this is kind of an ongoing thing. Public buildings, public facilities change use over time, and so even if a space is not currently a barrier to program access because the public doesn't go there now, there's a possibility that somewhere down the road the public might need access there. You should identify barriers in those locations regardless. They don't necessarily have to be fixed at this point in time if they're not preventing program access. Next, you need to come up with an idea of how you're going to fix these things. And the fixes for these things may be structural. You may say, hey, we're going to restripe this parking lot so it has the right number of parking spaces with the right access aisles and cross slopes and running slopes that don't exceed 2.1%, and connected to an accessible route to the accessible entrance to the building. So that would be a description of what you're going to do that would make a facility accessible. But the description might also say we are going to move all the programs from the old admin building over to the public library and the community center because we don't believe it is worth the investment in the old admin building to fix all of the barriers that exist there. We will relocate some of our employee spaces to that building and try to accommodate people there for employment, but we're not going to invite the public into that building. We're not going to have programs or services available in that building that would be impeded by physical barriers. And you have to, in any plan, time is a factor. So you're supposed to schedule these things and say, oh, let's get these things done while we have the budget, and these are going to be fairly easy to do. Let's get these done within the first 6 months. These things are going to take a little more planning. Let's say we'll get to these in our second year. Well, going back to when this regulation was written in the early 90s, we were in a situation where it was, perhaps an idealistic view that it wouldn't take more than a year to fix most of these things and bring things into compliance, and then if things went longer than that, you would, make up a schedule that would cover the rest of that time. And of course, somebody has to be responsible. Somebody's got to be delegated with the authority to make all of this happen. Just remember, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. If the only way you think you can fix stuff is by structurally making changes, you're gonna have a problem. So your transition plan is only the beginning. It's not the end. Remember, your priority is going to be providing program access and finding innovative ways to do that without getting out the jackhammer and the hammer and nails and the Sawzall. And you want to make sure that when your programs are viewed in their entirety, they're accessible, which doesn't mean they all have to exist in the same place. So you can change your venue, you can move something, or you can terminate a lease if it's going to be impractical to have a lessor change, have your landlord change their facility to make it accessible for you. They might not want to do that. I mean, maybe if you think you're going to terminate the lease and the landlord says, well, what can I do to keep you? You can get them to do the structural changes that need to be done. So do we have to fix everything? No. A transition plan should include every physical barrier that might prevent access to programs, but do you need to fix everything? No. It's not necessary to remove every one of those barriers. You want to be very strategic in how you do this and look at where and when and how you can provide program services and activities to the public without doing structural changes. Remember, it's the program that has the priority. There are other triggers, though. So if you've identified barriers in buildings, over time you may come up with reasons that these things do need to be taken care of. Of course, even if it's an employee area, you may need to make a reasonable accommodation for an employee. which might not necessarily be something that looks exactly like what the ADA standards would require, mostly just that it accommodates the ability of the employee to do their essential functions. You may have to change, you may have a change of facility use, so you've decided that this building that used to be an employee-only admin building, you're now going to offer, I don't know, let's say Pilates classes there. Well, once you're doing that, that's a program that's going to require accessibility for the public, so you would have to address that. Anytime you go into those buildings and do alterations and additions, anything that you're working on that's an element that has accessibility requirements, it's going to have to be brought up to the standards. If you did any of these, if you built any of these things wrong after January 26th of 1992, regardless of whether they're a program barrier or not, they need to be fixed. So remember, setting your priorities is the key thing. Provide access for the public from sidewalks, parking, public transportation. So site, when somebody arrives on a site, whether they get there by bus or walking or driving, they should be able to get to the facility. Provide access to specifically to those areas of facilities where services are provided for the public. And then beyond that, provide access to your restroom facilities, and then any other steps necessary to provide access to services and programs. Obviously, just making a building physically accessible is not going to help with things like effective communication. So remember, the questions you need to ask about your spaces and places, your facilities, is who uses it? Is it the public? Is it employees? Who is going to be served here? And what things would need to be done in order to make that possible. If it's an employee common area, if it's new construction or alterations, it needs to comply with the standards. If it's an employee common area and you have an employee or employees with disabilities, then you need to address the features that would make that area accessible to them, including break rooms and other areas that employees use besides their actual workspace. Actual work areas, you only really have to allow people to get in and out of those areas, but somebody's actual workspace, if they need an accommodation, you may need to do things to make that accessible. And if you've got areas that are open to the public, but they're assisted by employees or staff, they may or may not require those physical barriers to be removed. So that's pretty much everything I had to tell you today. Kind of rushed through that. There's a lot of ground to cover. You can see that getting into all the technicalities was not probably going to happen in this short session. But bear in mind that we do have a newsletter at the ADA Center. You can sign up for that. Check us out on our Facebook page. And if you have questions, I have time.
All right, folks, if you want to go ahead and type your questions into the chat box, the Q&A box, please feel free to do so. I think you actually covered one that came up. Had a question regarding a museum. You talked about a log cabin. There's a historical building. It has 2 floors, and there are some artifacts that are located on the 2nd floor of that facility. Is providing video access to those artifacts, is that acceptable?
In most cases, that would be. It would, and this is a case of where a lot of times these artifacts are under glass in a sealed container kind of situation. In other words, even people who are there on that floor are not going to actually touch or pick up those artifacts. If it were a case where there were things that people could actually, handle them, it might be good to provide some of those artifacts in another part of the museum that was accessible. If you do provide, video access or streaming access to those artifacts, then make sure it's, high resolution and that somebody is going to be able to see what somebody would be able to see if they were actually there. I know that at one time, I'm not sure if they still have it, but the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago actually had a 360 interactive tour of the U-505 submarine. So that somebody, obviously it's a space that you can't make accessible to people in wheelchairs. It's very tight quarters, but they went through there and kind of did the Google camera kind of thing where you go through and you get a total 360 of the space, so you can take a virtual tour inch by inch going through it.
Great, great. So just to kind of take that down the road a little bit, so the types of activities that you place in, so in this given museum, if there's something interactive, maybe that goes on the ground floor, and something that's simply a display, you could place in the upper level.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm waiting for questions there, folks. I'm not seeing questions. I know there are lots out there. I know they'll come. Doug, did you have anything that you wanted to bring up as we're waiting for questions?
I'm good.
You're good. All right. It's like nobody wants to ask. We've got a good group of folks here. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. That was a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
I just lost all my video and everything. I'm sorry. Great presentation. We appreciate the time that you've spent to provide this information to us, and also the resource that you have available out there. I know there are a lot of questions. People want to get into specifics, and they may not be quite prepared to ask those in this venue. Definitely feel free to talk to Jeff and the team there at the Rocky Mountain ADA Center. Those specific questions. If you have questions of us, we can help you where we can. If it's very detailed, we might have to go to Jeff and Chris and the folks there. But we appreciate that. Okay, final word.
I just call us or email us with any questions. I'm sure I threw a lot of stuff out there today, and it probably takes a little time to digest all of it, but you know, we're here to help.
Great. Thanks so much. We recorded the session. We'll throw that up on our website here the next day, and so you can go back and review that, and then call Jeff with questions. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.